Hello, everyone, and welcome to the SANS Threat Analysis Rundown live stream. Happy April. I am Katie Nichols, an instructor for Forensics 578 Cyber Threat Intelligence, also work at Red Canary, and I'm happy to be here with you on this beautiful April day. I'd love to hear, as always, let me know where you coming in from. We have folks internationally, which is always fun. I am here in Northern Virginia. It's a beautiful spring day. I hope wherever you are, you're having a great one. I know RSA is next week. For better or worse, I'm not going. So that's kind of nice. If anyone's going to RSA, I'd love to hear from you. Yeah, Brett's in Maryland, so good weather up there. I will not be going to San Francisco next week, but for any of you heading to RSA, I hope you have a lot of fun. There'll be a lot there crazy on the conference floor. I think Brett's going to. A lot of SANS folks will be there. So be sure, if you're going to RSA, stop by that SANS booth, say hello to folks. Eddie in California. So hopefully, it's always good weather in California, right? We don't need to know how the weather is. You can just rub it in our face. Anyways, it's the end of April, and we've a couple months into 2025. And so today, what I wanted to focus on is annual reports. So I've talked about these if you've joined the stream before, and I love these, which is why I was like, let's just talk about them for this live stream because there is so much value. I know folks have many different backgrounds, levels of experience. If you've been in this field for a decade, these are useful. If you are just joining, these are useful to give an overview of threat landscapes from a lot of different perspectives. And I should note, I'm not going to cover every company's annual report this year. I'm going to focus on some of my favorites. There is a great GitHub repository called Awesome Annual Security Reports that has many companies and teams. I can't talk about all of them. I'm going to focus on some of my favorites, including the big ones that came out this week. But these are great because it gives visibility into what different teams are seeing. Now, I'm going to talk first about the Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report. Then I'm going to talk about M-Trends. That's from Google Cloud Mandiant. I'm also going to hit CrowdStrike, and I'll briefly hit Red Canary's report. Disclosure, yes, I do work at Red Canary. I will point out why I'm sharing this because I think there's useful info. And regardless of who writes it, I find these reports are valuable because it gives you a fairly condensed version. I will say the data breach investigation report is 117 pages, but it gives you a fairly condensed view into the threat landscape from last year. Now, I know you're like, we're 4 months in. Luckily, adversaries haven't changed all that much. So the stuff from last year is still very relevant. And these reports are chock full of insights about actors, what you should do about it. And so I think it's really worth spending some time on them. I also recognize that maybe you don't have like hours to read 100-page reports. And so that's why today I kind of wanted to walk through and just give you a couple of things that stuck out to me, things to look at, etc. So that is the plan. I love, as you are walking along with these reports with me, if there's anything you find interesting or reports that I'm not talking about that you think are great, please shout. Love to hear what you think. So let's start with this one, the Data Breach Investigations Report from Verizon. This is a cool one because some of the others we're going to talk about are from cybersecurity vendors, which we'll talk about, right? Think about why people are issuing these. The Verizon one actually brings in data from a bunch of different organizations, which is cool because, right, I would argue they have less of a marketing goal, though I think they sell things too. The authors of the DBIR are also like giant data nerds in the best way possible. And if you read this one, there's so many like funny comments and like jokes, and like they have a call out for if AI is reading it. So the DBIR is just a really fun one. And this is one, if you have like a flight or like you just have an hour and you like to, kick up your feet and read this kind of thing. I found that just giving yourself some space away from your day-to-day job, which is in this industry always busy, just giving yourself a little bit of mental space. Maybe it's like a quiet Friday afternoon. You're hoping an incident doesn't come in, and just taking time to read this through and reflect on, like, what is this report saying? Is that similar or different from my perspective? And then what can we do? One of the things I love about these reports, and I'll point out in a few of them, there's so many ideas for actions to take, like enable MFA, which yes, I realize it's easy to read that in a report. It's much harder to do it. But I think these are a great use of time just to kind of sit back and reflect on what's your security program doing? What can you do better? So let's dive in, starting with the DBIR, right? And again, this is a lot of pages. I like that they include introduction and then how to use this report, right? One thing to note about DBIR, they map the intrusions that they are reporting on to this framework called Veris. It's interesting. We have like MITRE ATT&CK, which almost everyone has heard of, the kill chain. I found that a lot of people aren't as familiar with Veris, even though a lot of people have read the DBIR report. So Veris, we actually talk about this in Forensics 578. It breaks down, right, an intrusion into different parts. Focuses on threat actor, right, who's behind it, the action, what actions did that actor take, what tactics like malware or hacking, and then variety, right, more specifics. So Veris is a framework you might not have heard of much about, but what's cool about it is that a bunch of different contributors, right, over about 100 data contributors, if they're all mapping to Veris, then the Verizon DBIR team can compile that and look at it for patterns. So that's a little note about Veris if you hadn't heard of it. If you've read this report, it's mapped to Veris. Always nice to have an overview, right? If you don't have a lot of time looking at the table of contents and you're like, what actually interests me? Most reports will have this section that's kind of the big picture. And I think that's a good place to start, or summary of findings. So I just want to walk through and kind of point out a couple things that jumped out at me. Now, one thing I like to do is also look for commonalities across different reports. This is something, I haven't tried it, but I feel like AI and LLM would actually be really good if you just told it, read these reports and find a commonality. So if someone wants to do that, that'd be awesome. But I like to just in my mind think about, okay, what are the takeaways? And then the takeaways that multiple reports have, I feel like I can be more confident because every team has different visibility, right? And maybe one vendor is going to see a trend and another vendor doesn't. Okay, but the things that multiple teams see and recommend, those are usually a pretty good bet to focus on. So starting out, right, you're going to see a lot about vulnerabilities. And for many of these reports, for initial access vectors, like how do adversaries get in, you find kind of the top 2 or 3: credential abuse, exploitation of vulnerabilities, and phishing, right? And you'll see different names for credential abuse. This might be under the MITRE ATT&CK technique for valid accounts, etc. So looking at, right, how has it changed over time? What's different, etc. So credential abuse. This is an important one. I believe DBIR and others noted credential abuse is increasing. I think that's a commonality across a lot of reports. It makes sense, right? Why would adversaries try to figure out how to exploit a 0-day if they can just steal credentials and log in? One thing I called out, a lot of credentials allow adversaries to access these perimeter devices or exploit vulnerability in these edge devices. So thinking about exploitation of vulnerabilities, a lot of those are in edge-facing devices. Think of like firewalls or, right, servers that are facing the internet. And a lot of people aren't monitoring that. So they're giving credit, right? Orgs worked hard to patch those, but not fully remediated, which was an interesting finding. It seems like many orgs like tried to patch, but weren't successful. And then it took a median of 32 days to accomplish. 32 days, and we'll talk about dwell times and breakout times, but 32 days gives our adversaries a long time to exploit those vulnerabilities. So vulnerabilities are going to be kind of a key theme that you see in these reports. Ransomware. We always have the question of, is it getting better? Is it getting worse? Tough to say, right? From DBIR's perspective, 37% increase of ransomware. But, and this is one of the things that I appreciate about the DBIR team, sometimes our visibility is improving. And so maybe it's not all on the adversaries why this is increasing. It might be on our side as well, maybe increased visibility. I always like to look for good news. So saw an increase in ransomware that was observed. The good news, and I found this interesting, the average median amount paid for a ransom actually decreased, right? Previously it was 150 grand, now it's 115 grand. And 64% of victims didn't pay the ransom more than 2 years ago. That's interesting because, right, if you know much about ransomware and how law enforcement recommends you respond, what's the party line is don't pay the ransom, which is this weird like prisoner's dilemma type thing because, well, if no one paid the ransom, then adversaries might stop doing it. But it's often in my own organization's best interest to pay the ransom because if I am like being threatened with leaking a bunch of sensitive data, if I can pay $115,000 and stop that, that's actually a good decision because like that's going to probably cost less than the incident response cost. So it's this weird thing where you kind of don't want anyone to pay the ransom, but then someone pays the ransom and then adversaries know that it works and you'll pay. So this is an interesting signal, and I'm curious how this is going to develop over months and years. If we all agreed no one's ever going to pay a ransom, like theoretically, ransomware could stop because adversaries would be like, it's not worth it. And so I think this is a trend worth keeping an eye on, right? 64% of orgs say they didn't pay the ransom. If that keeps going up, maybe that's a good chance that ransomware becoming less profitable and then adversaries may be stopping it. I don't know. I think it's too early to tell, but something to consider with ransomware. Whenever you're reading these reports, as I mentioned, you need to think about the data, the visibility they have. And sometimes these changes could be because someone started tracking something or someone wrote a new detection analytic. What I appreciate is Verizon DBIR, this team calls out when there are changes like that. They saw significant growth in espionage-motivated breaches. Okay, it was in part because we had different contributors. Really appreciate that because sometimes people will like say, oh, espionage-motivated breaches increased like tenfold. Oh my gosh, APTs. And you're like, well, maybe you just got a new contributor who happens to see more espionage-motivated breaches. So I appreciate that as you're going through the DBIR. Talking about motivations, we often will bucket them into, right, espionage motivated, financially motivated, and this is another theme you'll see these buckets in these reports. I appreciated this call out. Espionage isn't the only thing that state-sponsored actors do. About 28% of incidents involving state-sponsored actors also had a financial motive. We often think, okay, you know, someone's spying for a country, they're just going to be motivated by espionage, but what if you're underpaid and you just want to steal cryptocurrency or credit card numbers on the side? So kind of an interesting takeaway there. Again, there's a ton of info. You will also see in almost all of the reports discussion of AI. And if you've joined the stream before, you know that I recommend caution when it comes to thinking about adversaries using AI. What I've seen as commonalities across these reports as I've looked at them, seems like multiple teams are observing that, right, Gen AI actors are using it. And one of the ways they are is generating email text, right? Generating phishing lures, etc. So I get a little bit cautious of this whole adversaries are using AI thing because sometimes people overestimate what that means and assume that adversaries are automatically going to be really sophisticated because of that. When, and we'll hit this across a few reports, often it's just making their phishing text better, right? Or making it easier for them to write a script. So, something to think about as you read about adversaries using AI. Cool. Yeah, I really love all of their titles. Like Alex Pinto is one of the authors. Like it's pretty fun. All of their interesting titles. Snowstorm advisories, right? Credentials. This is a theme across these reports. And what's so cool, they have all this data from all these organizations and they can start to break down, right? Where are these exposed secrets, credentials, keys, tokens? A lot of people overlook this one, right? In development and CI/CD environments, right? It's continuous integration, continuous deployment environments. A lot of these secrets that are used for access there, adversaries are stealing that, right? So figure 12, this is basically looking at as there's external scanning, right, of secrets within these repos. A lot of GitLab tokens, right? 50% of all secrets that are being leaked. So GitLab, that's where a lot of organizations store some of their, quote, crown jewels, right? Their code, all the internal things they're doing. If adversaries can get those secrets, like that can lead to a really, really bad compromise. And this is one that I think not quite enough organizations are paying attention to. One to consider, right? Where are those secrets? GitLab tokens, other credentials. People often think about credentials in terms of like usernames and passwords, but it's not just that. So definitely something to think about. All right, scrolling through, can't possibly read all of these. Digging into exploitation of vulnerabilities. Again, all of these metrics take with a grain of salt and caution, right? Exploitation of vulnerabilities was present in 20% of breaches, 1 in 5 breaches, 34% increase from last year. Okay, some of an increase, but I probably wouldn't panic yet. We talked about it earlier, and you're going to see this across many reports. So many of the exploited vulnerabilities are in edge devices. And I said we discussed motivation more, right? This is something used by both ransomware operators and espionage motivated actors. My recommendation is always thinking about the threats you're going to be affected by, the techniques that all different adversaries use or adversaries with different motivations use. It's probably a good place to prioritize for almost every organization. So watch out these edge devices, right? VPN appliances. I'm not going to pick on any particular ones, but there are a lot of common ones. I will say adversaries like to find vulnerabilities because these are an easy target. Right? A lot of people don't update them. You'll find recommendations throughout these reports. Some of them are going to be very obvious. Patch, right? But I like the kind of down-to-earth nature, like patch the ones that you have to have exposed to the internet. If you don't need it to be exposed to the internet, put it behind something, right? Behind a DMZ, etc. But if it has to face the internet, that's where you prioritize patching. You're going to see a lot of patching recommendations. Also, of course, a lot of multi-factor authentication. All right, this graphic actually gets to one of the comments. Laura was commenting on state actors, right? This is threat actor motives in breaches, right? Financial versus espionage. Sometimes it's both. I like to remind people that yes, APTs are scary and cool, and still the motivation for the majority of breaches that DBIR has seen, that Verizon has seen, financially motivated. So yes, espionage motivated is part of it, and it might be both. It might be something altogether different. So keep that in mind. Yeah, again, espionage motivation, yeah, that's a majority of state-sponsored, but also financial. They have to fund their activities somehow, as Laura said. All right, Gen AI. This is cool. Percentage of AI-assisted malicious emails over time. Now, whenever you're looking at reporting on adversary use of AI, you need to think about like, what's the source that they are using for this, because I'll admit, like many organizations do not have visibility and assessment of did AI write that email. So think about the visibility. This is cool. The line here, this one represents when LLM chat tools like ChatGPT started to become popular. So you can pretty clearly see assisted malicious emails has risen. That makes sense. This is where I think many organizations are seeing actors use AI, right? To help them write phishing text to make it more convincing. Call this out. 14% of employees were routinely accessing AI systems on their corporate devices, and a lot of them were using a non-corporate email. A little bit scary because you think about, right, what people are usually using those AI tools for. And it's often like, hey, here is some source code and can you help me write this, right? Write a script for this, or uploading something that might be sensitive. This is one of the bigger risks, in my opinion, around AI. I'm more worried about, right, the exposure of sensitive company information than an adversary using AI to find a 0-day. I think this is much more of a risk to many organizations. So if you don't already have a policy and ideally some kind of like network enforcement of those policies for company use, for employee use of AI, definitely something to think about. All right. Again, one of the things that I really like is calling out how the DBIR authors call out their biases, right? And they say this, maybe we as a community have gotten too good at capturing ransomware breaches. And I love when I read something in one of these reports and I'm like, I never really thought about that, because my assumption is always that we're underreporting ransomware breaches because no one knows about every breach, right? And a lot of people don't want to report. But it's interesting when you compare it to different types of breaches, like talk about like something that's just like stealing data, right? And no extortion on the dark web. Like maybe you're less likely to identify those. Ransomware actors, as we'll talk about in other reports, they often advertise, right, that they have breached an org. And so maybe we're actually overcounting compared to other types of breaches. It's kind of weird. Like, no, we're not capturing every ransomware breach ever, but maybe we're capturing them more often or we're sharing them more often than other types of intrusions, like maybe stealer activity. So kind of an interesting thought. I like these reports for changing a perspective. They are great data nerds. And there's also, if you're like a graphics nerd, a lot of good examples here. All right, let's see. Another thing I flagged, what we find, granted, across these different reports is that adversaries like to go where they think we're not monitoring or where we're not monitoring, those edge devices or servers. I see a lot of organizations who they have monitoring on maybe their endpoints or their identities, but not on servers. Servers are present in 95% of breaches based on their visibility. So kind of an important one. Again, thinking about, are there gaps in our monitoring, in what we're doing in our security program, can be really helpful. This was also interesting. How do we know about breaches as a community based on their data? Right, the top ways, discovery methods for breaches that actors haven't disclosed, because the ones where an actor says it was us, like that's pretty easy to identify. Infrastructure monitoring and reported by employee. A bunch of other things. What was interesting to me, infrastructure monitoring, I think of this as like all of the network monitoring that all of the SOCs are doing. Compare that to reported by employee. Like a 4% difference, that's pretty interesting. To me, like I sometimes will say, oh yeah, you should also do employee education, but it might not be that effective. This data actually tells me maybe I shouldn't dismiss user awareness programs quite so readily, because if that's almost as effective as infrastructure monitoring, think about like cost trade-off. If you're like in charge of a budget, how much does doing all of your infrastructure monitoring cost versus how much does it take to like buy a pre-made awareness program or have like a person do that as part-time? It's interesting. So this kind of tells me that it's probably worth, right, training your employees still. Shouldn't be the only thing, but this tells us a lot of employees are reporting unusual things. So that might be a good signal that there's a breach. Yeah, as Lenny says, this is an information goldmine. And the cool thing, these are free, right? Some of them, I will say, you have to provide your information. If you're really clever with OSINT, you can find the direct link. But yeah, there's just so much in here. And different pieces of this might be interesting for you. Right, we talked about this piece already, the median ransom paid decreased from the previous year. So I don't know. I'm excited to see if this one continues, and are we turning tides, or is this just kind of a blip, an anomaly in decreased ransom payment? And then again, right, as we talked about earlier, ransoms is not paid. Compare 2022, it was half and half, like who paid the ransom or not. right? 54% previous year, they didn't pay it. Now 64% of victims reportedly didn't pay. I don't know. I also don't know if we can believe this fully, but it's an interesting trend to keep an eye on. Again, with that idea, like maybe someday we can wipe out ransomware. You'll see a lot of the reports start with kind of the overall metrics, and then a lot of them will have deep dives into different topics. One that I highlighted here, MageCart, right? E-commerce sites being compromised, and then if you use your credit card, right, an adversary steals it. I think almost all of us have probably had our credit card stolen at some point. My guess is this is a pretty common way that this happens to all of us. And this is an interesting one because it's like MageCart, that's so boring. Some of us have a little bit of like threat interest bias. I don't know what to call it, like novelty bias. And I'm like, oh, MageCart, like someone's just skimming credit cards. Well, this is pretty important. Like 1% of system intrusion. Okay, but they also talk about how this might be undercounted, maybe because people like me are like, MageCart, that's not exciting. Show me the cool like APT stuff. So can be helpful as well. We talked about motivations and espionage actors. Many of the techniques that these state-sponsored actors are using, and this is another theme you're going to see, they're using stolen credentials, malware, deceiving users. Sometimes we'll see this in other reports. These are novel techniques. A lot of times they are not. They are common tactics, techniques, and procedures. One more point before we move on to a different report, because there's so much here. We've only made it through 45 pages, y'all. I know. But other sections, a lot of similarities here. We talked about security awareness programs and how maybe there's data to show these are actually effective. The CIS controls remain really, really solid. And I think this is a great way to think about across reports as well, which are the common controls and recommendations. I highlighted a couple I think are particularly important. Access control, you're going to see MFA as a recommendation in pretty much every report ever, right? Configuring your assets and software securely, just setting it up, making sure you have a password, implement your network securely. So again, so much more in the DBIR. Those were a couple of highlights that I found. Let me see if there's anything else that I really, really wanted to hit before we talk about the next report. Yeah. I think the others we'll hit on here. One last thing I wanted to hit before we move on. So we talked about the importance of user awareness. This is another graphic that shows, right, report rates by organizations' recent training status. So no is we haven't recently been trained. Yes is we have. And you can see, right, the report rates, like these dots, they're bigger and the percentages are higher. Right? This suggests that these security awareness efforts are actually effective. So kind of an interesting point. If you are thinking about a security awareness program, I think one takeaway from the DBIR is it's probably a good use of resources. All right, DBIR, we could spend like 3 more hours, but we have more reports. M-Trends from the Google Cloud Security Mandiant folks. This is another one I look forward to every year. 92 pages. It's a beastly one. Luckily, there's a table of contents. So as usual, it starts with kind of overview, and then there are specific deep dives, depending on what you care about. I don't know about you, like Web3 cryptocurrency threats, not on the top of my threat model. If you care about that, awesome, go for it. So let's dive in. I like kind of starting with the overall numbers just to get a lay of the land. Right. And there's so many cool graphics. If anyone has worked on one of these reports, like I know from my team, it takes so much time. One thing that's cool, M-Trends, they talk about how they're tracking different activity. And they discuss this idea of campaigns, right? A set of intrusions and then global events, like a kind of broader way to track campaigns. They have this neat graphic here. And I like this one as sort of just a summary of what the heck happened last year, right? You see they track different campaigns, right? Clusters of maybe phishing email, malware, et cetera. And they give it this like camp 23067. And then down here, They have these global events, right? So I think this was, forget which one this was, but kind of a cluster, a bunch of exploitation of these vulnerabilities, right? Combining these campaigns into a global event, like widespread exploitation of that vulnerability. And then, of course, it's showing over months. Like, how long did these last? So if you are tracking your own events, incidents internally, you could also get some inspiration from this. I think this is a cool idea of tracking campaigns and then the things like, I don't know, solar winds or the CrowdStrike blue screen, like those are global events. So kind of a neat one and a nice refresher on the many, many things that have happened over the past year. All right, I'm going to skip over some of the industry stuff. I want to explain why. There's kind of a natural inclination. People say, I want to know what threats are impacting my industry. So if you're a bank, right, you want to know what impacts other banks. That's fair. What I've seen is that industry alone isn't the biggest differentiator, though, right? If you have a Linux environment and you're a bank and there is a hospital that has a Linux environment, that's kind of weird, but you're going to have a more similar threat model than another bank who uses Windows. So in my experience, I've actually observed that it matters more the kind of data you have. If you have a super unpatched network, right? If you are using certain operating systems or devices. So industry can be one influence, but just think about that as you're trying to figure out the threats that matter, industry is one factor. I think there are more compelling ones. So don't rely on industry alone is my recommendation. I mentioned it with the DBIR, right? Initial access vectors, exploitation of vulnerabilities is going to be up there, and then stolen credentials. Percentages of these might vary a little bit, right? But I think across all the reports I've seen, it's exploitation of vulnerabilities, stolen creds, and phishing, right? Pretty common. Interesting analysis here. Percentage of intrusions began with web compromise increased from 5% to 9%. Doesn't sound that significant, but if you think about the volume they're looking at, like 4% is a decent increase. Thing to call out here, and other reports talk about this as well, watch out for malicious advertisements and search engine optimization poisoning. Malicious advertisements, this one's a little easier to mitigate because you can like have ad blocking software, but search engine optimization poisoning is a really tough one. This is where adversaries, they will, if I'm searching for, I don't know, best chocolate chip cookies, and an adversary knows that I'm going to search for that, they will, right, make a website that says best chocolate chip cookie recipe. And then if I click on that, it's going to be at the top of the search engine results. I click on that and I get malware. So be really careful if you're searching for chocolate chip cookie recipes. Or more commonly, it's like software. If you're like searching for graphics software, a lot of adversaries like to use that and optimize those results to deliver malware. So watch out for that one. Top 3, you want to look at common vectors, but also what are the ones like web compromise, SEO that are lurking right below the top. Think about what happened this year and still ongoing. The North Korean IT workers, we talked about it on the stream before. That was an interesting one because it, I think, emphasized the importance of looking at insider threats, right? Something that a lot of teams don't investigate a whole lot of. And this is an interesting one, kind of blending, looking for patterns, maybe remote monitoring and management tools, and then also thinking about how do we hire employees? What practices do we have there? Vulnerabilities. I mentioned look for commonalities. The DBIR said it, M-Trends says it. Most frequently exploited vulnerabilities affected security devices, which are typically placed at the edge of a network. Yep. The more that you hear this, the more confident you are that this is a pattern that many teams are seeing, right? And you can see, not to pick on any vendor, but right, their adversaries are exploiting their software because it's facing the edge, it's facing the internet. So details of different vulnerabilities here, but that edge device, that is one of the themes. Right? Thinking about how did we identify the compromises? DBIR had this as well, right? Adversaries let you know about total. They thought 14%. So this would be, leak sites. Someone calls and tells you, hey, give us money or we're going to leak all your data on the dark web, right? Adversaries can notify us. Internal identification, right? 43%. External entity, right? This is law enforcement, cybersecurity companies, industry partners. This surprised me a little bit as being kind of high, right? So you'd think so many organizations are investing in security, but only 43% of breaches or incidents were discovered internally. It's the same number as external. So to me, this says probably need to be making friends, right, with other companies, right? If you're part of an ISAC or ISAO, some kind of sharing group, because it's very possible that someone outside of your own organization might know that you're breached before you are. An interesting takeaway there. There are different metrics measuring how long adversaries are in networks, and M-Trends uses dwell time, which I really like, right? This is the number of days an attacker is in an environment before they are detected. How long are they hanging out before we find them? Pretty similar, right? From the previous year to the past year, 10 to 11 days. Kind of think about this. 11 days, like before we identify them, like that's not great, but it is better than it used to be, right? Look across back to 2011, 416 days. So this is an interesting one to track, right? Pretty similar to last year. It's gone up a little bit. Extra day, is that meaningful? Maybe, maybe not. But kind of interesting to look at this, right? That's how long adversaries lurk before we detect them. Ideally, we want to try to get that time down. So think about dwell time as something, if you're running an internal SOC or a threat team, think about measuring your own dwell time. How long for you as an adversary in an environment before you've detected them? All right, moving right along, and you can get to a lot of different metrics here. Good news here. I always like to call it the good news, right? The percentage of investigations discovered in 1 week or less. This year, 45% of investigations, right, of breaches were discovered in less than a week. That's pretty good. Less than a week, like that's pretty impressive. And a little bit of good news again, that increased. So maybe we as defenders are getting a little bit faster, especially internally. Talked about motivations, right? Again, just a different take on it from M-Trends versus DBIR. Very similar takeaways though. Adversaries like to steal data. One thing that fascinates me is when teams explain how many malware families and groups they are tracking. Mandiant began tracking last year 632 new malware families. Yeah, that's a lot. Now Mandiant, they have some of the best researchers in the business, really, really sharp folks. They have a huge team. If you think about if you're a single security person or you have a small team, you're probably not going to be able to track all of those malware families. 632 is just the new ones. 5,500 are the total tracked malware families that Mandiant tracked last year. That's kind of a lot. So this is a data point saying you need to prioritize. These reports are great for that. And we'll talk about, right, how some malware family is much more prevalent than others, but this tells you, no, you cannot, unless you have a huge, huge team, you're probably going to struggle to track 5,500 malware families. Something I found interesting, right? We as a community, we focus so much on Windows. When you look at the malware families that Mandiant observed, 74 malware families on Linux, which is very interesting. When you think about the volume of reporting that we see, so much of it is on Windows. So right, definitely worth keeping an eye out. Many organizations use Linux, whether you're monitoring it and know it or not. So something to keep an eye out there. What Linux malware is out there? Are we protected against it? Different categories of malware. If you are newer, I wanted to highlight this. I know I'm a nerd, definitions. Like, what are the different types of malware? Backdoors, cred stealers, a dropper, a launcher. If you're newer and you just read these reports and learn even a little bit of this, really, really good foundation. So let's look at what is the most frequently seen malware. Now, Mandiant likes to use some of their own names. Some of these overlap with others in the community. Beacon is their name for CrowdStrike. Now, you might be like, CrowdStrike, seen really frequently. It was the most frequently seen malware in 2024. Well, the good news, however, CrowdStrike use or Beacon use has decreased significantly, right? 28% in 2021, 15, 10, 5%. Again, I like to look for the good news. The good news is, seems like the kind of takedown actions, right? The Operation Morpheus, which was an effort to decrease illicit use of CrowdStrike, seems like this is pretty impactful. This has been impactful, which is a great piece of news. If you look, though, if adversaries aren't using CrowdStrike, what are they using? System BC is one that to keep an eye on that kind of has some similar functionality to CrowdStrike. So it'll be interesting to see if System BC comes in and takes CrowdStrike's place, or Beacon rather. So the other thing to call out here, you'll see ransomware covered in a lot of these reports. Now, important to think about how ransomware can mean two things. It can mean the operators, the humans behind it, and it can mean the code, the malware itself. So here, right, Mandiant means the malware itself. Ransom hub malware, the code that does the actual things on the system, rather than the human operators. Kind of an interesting nuance that I think I overlook as well. So common malware families, right? You can learn a little bit about them. Bootloader, Lockbit. Again, this is the ransomware, the code, rather than the operators. Mandiant also has cool detail. Again, if you have a more mature threat intel team, I recommend looking at the methodology, right? I thought it was cool how they explained how they track campaigns and global actions. Mandiant explains that when they identify new activity that they can't link to an existing group, they call it an UNC, right? Uncategorized. And then they try to tie things back, and then they will eventually graduate the UNCs to an APT, espionage motivated, state sponsored, or a fin group, right? Financially motivated. So good to kind of get a sense of how is their methodology working. Again, looking at these numbers, 737 newly tracked threat groups. That is a lot, but, right, which ones were observed? Only 300 were observed. So there are a lot out there. Maybe we don't see all of them in every industry or every organization every day. Just emphasizing the importance of prioritizing your threats, because I cannot track 737 threat groups. Not a chance. Motivations. Again, we talked about that in the DBIR report, and we see it here. Observed threat groups by goal, reinforcing that a lot of times the goal is financial gain versus espionage, reminding us that yes, state-sponsored actors are fascinating. The majority of observed goals, though, it's financial. And as we've talked about, it could be both. Ransomware. It's going to be in every report. They were about 21%, about a fifth of Mandiant response investigations. Some things change over year. Some things stay the same. Initial access vectors for ransomware. You've probably heard me say it before, or someone else. Remote desktop protocol. There's a joke that it stands for ransomware deployment protocol, because of how often those RDP login attempts are how a ransomware breach starts. So a lot of these things familiar. They are not necessarily new or novel. That's okay. It's also helpful to get a reminder that yes, doing the basics, right? Multi-factor authentication still remains really important. Helps us kind of ground our priorities. All right, so looking at dwell time for ransomware specifically, kind of interesting. 56% of all the ransomware related intrusions or events with a week or less of dwell time. Some of these metrics I kind of get backwards on. So I like graphics. All of our dwell time, 45%, ransomware, 56%, non-ransomware, 42%. So this is much easier for me to understand versus the text that I was like, wait, what is this saying? More often, ransomware is detected quicker. That's a TLDR. Makes sense, right? We can identify that really quickly. Ransomware, often the pre-ransomware behaviors are very noisy. So good opportunities here. But again, I think the good piece of good news here is that a lot of intrusions defenders are identifying within a week. Scrolling through here, ransomware actors, right? We talk about the different tools that actors use. A note here that they're more likely to rely on publicly available, legitimate tools like credential stealers, and diving in, right? Ransomware actors, what tools did they use? Utilities like psexec, right? And then credential stealers. Those are commonly observed in ransomware intrusions. The good news is these are very detectable. So giving you priorities for what you should focus on trying to detect, and more definitions if you like definitions. Again, looking at frequent tools used in ransomware intrusions, psexec, netscan, nltest, mimikatz. There are many, many ideas out there for how you can detect these tools. Look at something like Sigma, or I'll bring up the Red Canary detection report, has lots of detection ideas. So prioritizing the things that adversaries are doing, that is always a winning bet. Looking at ransomware a bit more, one of the interesting things we see with ransomware, the ransomware landscape, is actors like to go away and then others come in and take their place, right? So Lockbit, there was a massive law enforcement action against them. So you can see kind of in the black here, kind of decreased over time, but then, right, who came in? Ransom Hub, a new ransomware group. And I say new because the actors maybe have been around for a while, but maybe they're just operating under a different name now. Worth keeping an eye on Ransom Hub, though. They definitely have been creating a lot of havoc, responsible for a lot of different intrusions. Akira, another one that across many different teams' visibility, was very active. Talk a little bit about cloud compromises. This is another section that you'll see in a lot of these reports, right? What happened in these intrusions? 2/3 of them, over 2/3, involved data theft, which makes sense. And a lot of those financially motivated, right, involved some type of data theft and extortion. You'll see throughout these reports mentions of different actors, right? UNC 3944, which roughly overlaps with Scattered Spider or the many other names, a lot of overlaps. Were pretty active last year. Some early signs that maybe their activity is decreasing, but these TTPs likely going to persist. Using social engineering to gain access, right? Convincing staff to reset passwords. So UNC 3944, worth keeping an eye on their TTPs. You'll find there's often like deep dive case studies or incident deep dives, and I'd recommend kind of skimming through, figuring out which are the ones that are applicable to you, and then diving into those. In this case, right, I thought the interesting tidbit here was UNC 3944 teamed up, right, used Ransom Hub ransomware, and they also moved data to cloud hosting. So interesting TTPs you can learn from here. And then, of course, everyone loves MITRE ATT&CK. I do too. I have my attack matrix on the wall. If you want to look at commonalities with techniques, you can kind of guess, right? Command and scripting interpreter, very, very common technique. This includes like Windows command line, PowerShell, all of that. So if you're a MITRE ATT&CK fan, you've got that too. Well, time is flying. Let's continue on. Let's take a brief look at CrowdStrike's global threat report. Images are a little scary, so they're a little weird. To each their own. They are very impactful. So a couple things to scroll through here as we scroll through kind of the scary images. It'll be interesting to see at RSA what they have on the booth floor. Sometimes they have scary statues. Some trends we haven't hit on yet. Briefly mentioned UNC 3944, phishing, voice phishing. If you love or hate that name, it's okay. It's happening, right? CrowdStrike seeing that voice phishing attacks continuing to rise. That's kind of important. I thought this was an interesting description. Malware free. Almost 80% of detections were malware free, right? Expressing that adversaries are doing a lot of living off the land. Think of traditional malware like a stealer. Well, a lot of times adversaries aren't even using that. Let's scroll through and hit a couple of key takeaways here, right? Malware free. Adversaries using a lot of built-in binaries. That is not a new thing, but it's good to know that it's still there. In M-Trends, we saw the dwell time, right? In CrowdStrike, they talk about breakout time, which is kind of interesting. That's the time to move laterally from the initial foothold. I think both dwell time and breakout time can both be really, really helpful to look at. I like this one because, to me, the important thing is that you catch it before it spreads. And that's the breakout time metric, right? So I like this one. This is a little nerve-wracking. 48 minutes was the average for interactive e-crime intrusions. Now, maybe it's not all intrusions, but 48 minutes, that's pretty quick. You need to detect them pretty quickly before they break out, move laterally, and make things worse. Deep dive here, another social engineering attack. This is one that a lot of organizations saw. I can't remember how they mapped Curly Spider to other groups, but social engineering, a common technique here, adversaries will basically spam a victim, getting a ton of spam emails, and then they'll call and say, hey, you've been getting all this spam. I can help you with that. And let me help you install this remote monitoring and management tool so I can help you stop all of this annoying spam. Surprisingly effective. One of the themes you will see in many, many of these reports, RMM tools, remote monitoring and management tools. I've said this before and I'll say it again. I think one of the more effective ways that organizations can prevent misuse is by knowing the RMM tools that are allowed. And then if you see unauthorized use or one of these being installed, have a really quick detection response. It'll help you respond to ransomware intrusions, social engineering intrusions, and many, many others. So RMM tools, that is one of the themes that you will see across these threat reports. Voice phishing remains really effective. And I think adversaries are realizing just go to the humans, right? A lot easier than trying to craft some custom malware. Social engineering, phishing, we talked about, right? The rise of that. Lots of other details here. RMM tools, I talked about it because adversaries continue to use them. Let me hit briefly on one final report here from a company that I work for, full disclosure, Red Canary. I cover it because this is another threat report I've heard from many in the community that is really valuable. So this one, I would say, focuses a lot on detection, broken down into trends, and then top threats, and then top techniques. So deep diving into each of those, the thing that I feel really good about for my team, and I'll just pop into one page as an example. Scarlet Goldfinch, this is a cluster named by Red Canary. Links to different resources. You can watch a video, right? This is a timeline. And the thing that I think is cool about these reports, and you can access these right directly on the website, any ideas for detection opportunities. And then if you're familiar with Red Canary's Atomic Red Team, that's also a cool open source community project where you can validate. So this is a PDF version because I personally like PDFs and it's easy to show, but there are links to lots of different detection opportunities from this Red Canary threat detection report. So this one, only 66 pages. So much information in here. Again, even if you take one of these and spend like an hour reading through it, take a few minutes, take a look. What are the themes? What are the things that you have and have not thought about? Things that you know about, you're like, yeah, I'm good on RMM tools, but I didn't really think about a user awareness program. that's where you should focus, right? Look at what other people are talking about with threats. Take those lessons, actions, even if you do one action based on reading one of these reports, it's a really, really great opportunity to kind of take stock of what your program's doing and where you could improve. It takes so much time if you have joined us before, like to look through all these threat reports. So, right, as someone said in the beginning, these are gold mines, really, really awesome resources. And again, these are just 4 different reports, right, from 4 companies. There are so many others in that GitHub repo, or if you know of others, love to hear about them in the chat. We've talked so much about all of these threat patterns. We were coming up on time. Just a couple of reminders on the SANS side. There are always SANS summits happening. Actually, there's one happening today. Didn't realize that when I scheduled, right? The leadership summit, the ransomware summit is coming up. So if you find any of the ransomware content from today interesting, definitely check that one out. I think our AI summit is actually coming up as well. So lots happening on the SANS side. If you are interested in ransomware, hope to see you. I'll be lurking at that ransomware summit. Let me just check. That is on Friday, May 30th. So a little over a month from now. That'd be a great one to check out. But lots going on as always. All right. With that, that is all I have for you today. Thank you all for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed our kind of annual report rundown. That's all I have. I'm Katie Nichols. I hope to see you next month. Have a great day.